So thank you. I think, how many we have? 45 attendees. That's fantastic. So thanks to all of you for being here today. This is the most recent talk in the Building Resilience in Food and Health Supply Chains seminar series, which is hosted at the University of Toronto and specifically housed within the School of Cities. And I'm one of 5 conveners for this particular series. My colleagues include Tracy Galloway, Laura Rosella, Christopher Beck, and Michael Widener. And I know that we have people tuning in from places throughout the world, at least I'm assuming as much. But as I mentioned, this speaker series is housed at the University of Toronto. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates, it has been the traditional land of several Indigenous populations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And today it's, we're grateful for this opportunity to continue to work and live on this land today. And also, before I introduce our next speaker, I would just simply like to make people aware that we have several talks coming up through mid-April. And next week we will have Susan Chatwood, who is an associate professor of public health at the University of Alberta. We don't have a title or talk from her just yet, but I'm anticipating that this will touch upon our interests in the food and health systems in the northern communities here in Canada. And then the subsequent week, we'll have Professor Jean-Louis van der Ploeg from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, who'll be speaking on unraveling heterogeneity and strengthening resilience. But today, however, it's my genuine privilege to introduce Dr. Evan Fraser, Professor Evan Fraser from Guelph University. Professor Fraser is a professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at Guelph, and where he's also the director of the Arel Food Institute. Now, Evan, or Dr. Fraser, however you want to refer to him, is one of those accomplished people that leave the rest of us feeling rather substandard and wondering how in the world he does all that he does. Professor Fraser has several well-earned accolades. He's a fellow of the Trudeau Foundation. He's a fellow with the Canadian Geographic Society. And recently he was announced as a member of the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council. Professor Fraser has written extensively about food and environmental issues, as well as food security. These include 2 popular books. One is a very fascinating read, The Empires of Food, Feast, Famine, and the Rise and Fall of Civilizations, as well as a graphic novel entitled Food Crisis. Most recently, just this past year, he co-published a book entitled Uncertain Harvest, The Future of Food in a Warming Planet, along with Ian Mosby and Sarah Rotz. And that was published by University of Regina Press, excuse me. And he's also published more than 100 academic book chapters and academic articles in renowned publications like Global Environmental Change, Environmental Research Letters, Ecology and Society, Geoforum, and Ecological Economics. And in addition to all of that, Professor Fraser is a very active and creative public intellectual. As I mentioned, he's published the graphic novel. He's also created a gold-winning card game about food security. He's published in a number of popular outlets, including the Globe and Mail, the Guardian, the Walrus, and Foreign Affairs. And he also has a fantastic and very informative video series called Feeding 9 Billion, which all of you can access through YouTube. And today, Professor Fraser will be speaking to us about food systems in the shadow of the pandemic, some thoughts on building a more resilient on building more resilient food systems post-COVID. So Evan, Dr. Fraser, thanks so much for being here. We're really looking forward to your talk today.
Thanks, Ryan. Very nice of you and very generous introduction. Nice to see, I guess, almost 50 people, and I've recognized a bunch of names on the list of folks that have jumped on. I just saw Charles Levco jump on. So how's it going, Charles? And it would be nice to go out for a beer with you, but I guess next year, hey? So this talk is about COVID in the food system and resilience. And, to set it up, let's put our minds back to that scene of March of last year. Certainly the predominant feeling of fear and anxiety as we walked into grocery stores and saw the empty shelves. Certainly I contributed to that problem by panicking and buying a lot of toilet paper and a lot of pasta. And I think based on our experiences collectively, we all did that. Quickly following the sight of those empty shelves, though, came the stories of tidal wave of food waste, which happened when the restaurants closed. Major concerns raised by farmers, I beg your pardon, about whether they'd be able to get the foreign workers they needed into the farms. And then, of course, there was that moment when, come on, slides, there we go, when about 3/4 of our beef packing capacity closed as workers tested positive for the virus. So for me, based at the University of Guelph, March, April, May, June in particular, sort of a whirlwind where we all tried to make sense of what on earth COVID meant for the food system. And a response that some of us came up with was to create a program that we called Growing Stronger, aiming for resilience in the Canadian food system. And really, this lecture today is designed to do two things if I'm successful. First, I would like to introduce you to Growing Stronger and its findings. And then after I've done that, which will essentially be a little bit of a rehearsal of what happened over the last year, I'll explore some potential strategies or types of strategies. I'm not going to get granular into the policies, but if people want to get granular into the policies, the Q&A times to do that, but specifically about the sorts of strategies that might be useful in building resilient regional food systems. So starting at the beginning with Growing Stronger, I would start then back at the beginning of the lockdown, almost exactly a year ago, when things were looking very, very uncertain and quite frankly, for most of us, scary. And a friend of mine named Rory McAlpine called me up, and Rory has recently retired, but he for many years was the senior vice president for government relations at Maple Leaf, so our largest food processor. And Rory called me up last March, and he said he really hoped that some organization like the University of Guelph or the Aral Food Institute at the University of Guelph would embark on a process to actually learn the lessons of COVID for the food system. And he was really concerned that for people like him, who were really sort of on the front line of keeping the grocery store shelves full, people like him were too distracted with the day-to-day management of the crisis, dealing with requests for information from government and uncertainty around the working conditions in their plants, to really reflect on the lessons. So a group of us came together, partly under the auspices of the Aral Food Institute that I direct, partly under the auspices of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. And we reached out to pretty much every facet of the Canadian food system. I'm not going to suggest that we were perfect, but in our advisory network, we had the head of major farm organizations, senior people in the retail sector. We had formal input from people that ran both very large and very small food processing operations, people who understood about farm labor. We had Indigenous representation, community groups working on food insecurity were involved, nutritionists, and a couple of academics like me. And what we did is hosted a series of online events where we listened to each other's perspectives. I interviewed people from across the food system back in August and September of last year. And then really in a collaborative process, we worked together over a number of months over the fall to distill lessons down to key recommendations. And there's two things that I'd like to highlight here. One is the recommendations that I will talk about in a second. And linked with that is the timeline that I'll go through in a second. But also one thing that I want you to pick out from my talk, which is hopefully a theme that comes out in all my slides and all my comments, is the need for collaborative dialogue to shift change. And the theory of change that I'm working on at this point in my career is that change happens when you bring people together to talk. And it's not sexy, it's not particularly intellectually satisfying. It's a grind, but it's the way I think change happens. So I'm just sort of foregrounding the theory of change that's behind a lot of my comments here. At any rate, out of all this work, we constructed a very deliberate timeline of what happened that I'd like to run through with you. And we begin with, of course, those grocery store shelves that were empty that I mentioned a few minutes ago. I think that we all can recognize that although that was a terrifying 2 or 3 week period when we watched our grocery stores empty, in actual fact, that skyrocketing demand prompted by panic buying was pretty much a short-term issue. Grocery stores, food processors, truckers, farmers, everybody along the food chain worked quite heroically to bring our supply chains back online, I would say remarkably quickly. And they were helped by government policy. For instance, government policy that allowed stores to resupply 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Typically, grocery stores can't resupply at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning, but they were allowed to resupply 24/7 last spring. So most consumers didn't notice much more than short-term hiccups. But with that said, the relative stability of our grocery store system over the last year, I do not think is something we should take for granted. In particular, some of the interviews I did, especially with the corporate sector, were really revealing. And it gave me sort of an emotional appreciation of the extraordinary hard work, adaptability, and probably also, you might say, innovation, social innovation that went into keeping grocery store shelves stocked. So one executive said to me, the system didn't break, but it came close to breaking on a couple of key points. Keeping sanitizers moving into the dairy industry to keep our dairy operations functional was a pinch point, for instance. And who would have known that sanitization in the dairy sector was something that almost derailed our dairy sector? And anyway, my point here isn't to go through a sort of forensic accounting of everything, but to say that I believe that Canadians everywhere really owe a significant debt of gratitude to people who work on the front line of the food system. And I, for one, would like to say thank you to everybody who spent some time in the last year stocking a grocery store shelf, like my brother, driving a food truck, working in a food processing plant, laboring on a farm, because those people kept us fed, and I don't think we should take that for granted. Second major effect on the supply chain, or on the food system, was the supply chain. So when restaurants closed, universities shuttered, sports halls went dark, there was a really fundamental change to our supply chain. So the slide here is one of the sort of weirder lessons that we learned last year. I didn't know this, but the vast majority of potatoes consumed in Canada were eaten in restaurants in the form of French fries. And so potato farmers really suffered, and we lost millions of pounds of potatoes into landfill that there were simply no market for. Farmers with contracts to sell milk for coffee shops dumped product. And of course, as we all know, but this is kind of amusing, so I think it's worth restating, as all of us cooped up at home, we all discovered we just love to bake. And so flour, eggs, yeast, all that stuff became scarce. And to have a little bit of fun with this one became hits home to me. This is the homemade ravioli that I made with my 10-year-old daughter during the early days of the first lockdown. And here you see the ravioli that we made in August, months later. And let me assure you that a lot of flour was used between these two photos being taken. But this actually raises an important point. As supply chains shifted, we not only wasted a tsunami of food, we also discovered these strange hidden vulnerabilities. So for instance, egg packaging became a major issue that caused an enormous amount of waste. This is because when restaurants buy eggs, they buy large volumes, and eggs are packed in flats of 144 eggs, 12 by 12. When you or I buy them for our home consumption, even if we're making huge amounts of homemade ravioli, we buy them by the dozen. And so the egg industry found itself short of 12 cartons. So it wasn't the shortage of eggs as so much the shortage of the right size of packing material that caused eggs to be dumped and made them scarce throughout much of March, April, and May. The third major effect of the pandemic, and we're actually moving into the much more serious long-term effects, in my opinion, was the effect on labor, both in terms of the temporary foreign workers that come and work on our farms and in terms of the meat processing sector. So what this reveals to us is that relatively poorly compensated hand labor, much of which is done by folks who are either come to Canada on temporary visas or are relatively new Canadians that come to Canada from places such as the Philippines. These people are the backbone of many parts of our food system. And so early in the pandemic, as the governments were considering travel bans, I was a part of conversations with some farm groups that began to panic, that point out that every year 60,000 people come from Latin America or the Caribbean to prune our apple orchards and pick our strawberries. And the government responded appropriately by expediting visas and providing some funding to farmers to retrofit dormitories to try to allow for social distancing. But as the slide here reminds us, some of the most persistent hotspots of COVID-19, certainly in Ontario and in British Columbia in particular, well into last summer, were linked with the Foreign Agricultural Worker Program. People died as a result of this. And so this was not only an unbelievable challenge in terms of supply management and managing our food system, it was a direct and awful tragedy for many, many, many families. With all that said, though, it's really important not to vilify the farmers, because at risk here, I think, is a bigger issue that COVID reveals. And it's that agriculture faces a major skills and labor shortage, and it has for decades. The Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, which brings these people in from the Caribbean and Latin America, it was actually established in the 1960s as a stopgap measure that was intended to address what was perceived in the 1960s as a short-term labor shortage. 60 years later, we're structurally dependent on this system. And here we have to recognize something that is pretty uncomfortable for a lot of us. It's a largely racialized folks who are working on white-owned operations who suffered the brunt of this. So the problem of workers testing positive for the virus reveals symptoms of much bigger issues facing society linked with the nature of economy, colonialism, and race. And COVID has brought these things to the surface. Similarly, the environment of working in the meat processing industry has also been revealed as a big vulnerability. And as I noted a few minutes ago, one point last summer, 3/4 of our beef packing capacity was closed because workers had tested positive for the virus and plants had to shut. And largely those workers were new Canadians, specifically from the Philippines. So not only was this terrible for those workers, it illustrates how our extremely economically efficient, quote, just enough, just in time food system struggled to adapt. And one of the problems specific to the meatpacking industry was that in an effort to create enormous economies of scale, we're now in a situation where a very small number of meatpacking plants serve essentially continental-sized markets. And this frankly proved brittle in the face of the virus and caused big disruptions for consumers, big impacts on farm income, and absolute tragedy for the workers in those plants. The fourth major effect of the pandemic on the food system was, of course, the effect on food insecurity. And we already lived in a country with unacceptably high levels of food insecurity, where approximately 1 in 10 Canadians before the pandemic regularly faces problems of access to food. The pandemic has accelerated this, has exacerbated this, has made it much worse. With lost wages and soaring unemployment, especially triggered by the closing of the restaurant service food sector, food banks have never been busier. Some major food banks have reported a doubling in the number of people requiring emergency assistance. Speaking at the international level, we see the United Nations projecting that the number of hungry people in this world will double over the last 6 to 12 months. And in the words of the head of the World Food Program, on the cusp of them winning the Nobel Peace Prize last year, famines of biblical proportions are on the horizons. And indeed, this screen capture was taken in the middle of the summer. Indeed, the data on hunger released by the United Nations in the fall suggests that this was not a particularly alarmist statement. But a critical conclusion from all of this work is that food insecurity is rising, not because we're not producing enough food or because of distribution or disruptions. Rather, food insecurity is rising because of lost wages and unemployment. Food insecurity is a social and an economic issue. It has no relationship really with production. And as I said a moment ago, issues of race and colonialism come to the surface because it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are much, much more likely to suffer from food insecurity. So one of the conclusions from the Growing Stronger report is that there's actually nothing new here. COVID didn't create new problems as much as it brought old ones right to the surface. So with that being said, I want to bring part one of my talk to a close and just summarize with a few key points that I'd like to leave you with for this part of my talk. When I stand back from the impacts of the last year and I try to synthesize them, I think there's a few conclusions that we need to draw. First, I really do think that we should be proud and grateful as Canadians that our food system did as well as it did, and that in Canada anyways, we have a remarkably resilient system given the scale of the perturbations, and goodness me, we consumers owe a debt of gratitude to the folks on the front line of the system that kept us all fed. Second, I'll be a little bit more aggressive on this comment. I believe that our dependency on poorly compensated hand labor as a cornerstone of our food system, it really has to stop. And that means we need to work with the sector, not in a way that vilifies people, because I don't think anybody is particularly to blame, but we need to establish better labor standards. And I've got lots of suggestions on that as people are interested in asking me questions. But I also think, and this may be controversial, and I'm not saying that this is the hill I'm going to die on, but I think we need to pivot our system away from using as much labor as it currently does. And that means automation. My third wrap up is I believe that we need to put systems in place that will allow industry better ways of managing their supply chains so that we balance the efficiency of our current just enough, just in time systems with a greater need for resiliency. Fourth, as a subset of number 3, I think we want to repatriate fruits and vegetable production in particular, reduce our reliance on imports as much as possible. And I think we probably want to try to work at a policy level to decentralize processing of food. And then finally, we have to recognize, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think it needs to be restated and restated and re-restated. Food insecurity will only be tackled through wages, employment, education, equity, and social programming. We have to remind ourselves continually that. And too often I get involved in conversations that draw a link between what happens on the farm and food insecurity in downtown Toronto. And we have to remind ourselves that we will not solve food insecurity in downtown Toronto by supporting farmers. We can support farmers for lots of good reasons, but we need to be working on social and equity issues to solve food security. So that being said, I'd like to shift and jump off into something which hopefully is a little bit more pointed by way of recommendations of what we derived from the Growing Stronger program. And to kick this part of my talk off, I will simply misquote one of the most misquoted figures of the last 6 months, Winston Churchill, who apparently famously once said that we should never waste a good crisis. I, of course, have absolutely no idea if Churchill ever said that, but it seems to be emblematic of the moment. And I think most of us sense that society is at a bit of a teachable moment when perhaps the opportunity to do things differently is actually thrust upon us. And like many people with an interest in food and food systems, I actually believe that the effects of COVID will prove to be so significant that the time is now to reimagine how the systems work that bring us our daily bread. So I'd like to develop this thesis by raising 3 key points that frame the final report from the Growing Stronger process. And the first has to do with food insecurity. As I've said multiple times, Canada has too long had a major problem with food insecurity. The pandemic has made this worse, shifting us probably from 1 in 10 Canadian families who regularly experience food insecurity to 1 in 7 or 1 in 8. It's a little hard to get good data, but it's something like that shift, that order of magnitude. But again, we have to remind ourselves, food insecurity is a problem related to poverty and inequality, low wages, and colonial and racial issues. So as a result, if Canada wants to ensure that we are resilient to the next major problem in our food system, we have to address the root causes of poverty and food insecurity. And this means that we really need to be thinking about basic income or income floors. And there's a lot of subtlety and complexity and nuance in the specific policy recommendations around what it would take to ensure that every Canadian receives or has access to enough funds to live a dignified life. Matched with that are programs related to school nutrition. Matched with that are programs related to engagement with Indigenous and First Nations communities, and realizing the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a bundle of progressive policies linked with social equity, colonialism and racism, poverty that need to be embarked on aggressively if we want Canada to be resilient from a consumer perspective in terms of food insecurity. The second big recommendation that we made out of the Growing Stronger program relates much more to agriculture, the economy, and the environment. And to be honest, this is actually where my own personal academic background sits in, and it's where I feel more comfortable getting into the weeds and discussing the details, because this is the areas that I know more about. And it was really interesting, though, at the same time as the folks I was interviewing and interacting with in the summer and into the fall, we're discussing the challenges of labor and the difficulties of keeping our temporary foreign worker labor force free of virus. people were also identifying that agriculture has the potential to be the driver of a green or environmentally friendly economic development program. And in digging into this sort of environmentally friendly agriculture as the cornerstone of an environmentally friendly recovery platform, there were two key sub-themes that kept coming out again and again. And the first relates specifically to supply chains. And I heard a lot about how Canada and many parts of the world have adopted that proverbial just enough, just in time system that allows for those economies of scale, but was revealed to be vulnerable. All the stuff I spoke about a couple of minutes ago. As a contrast to that, or in reaction to that, a number of people started saying to me, what we have to do is shift from that just enough, just in time supply system to a just in case supply system. Whereas opposed to managing things as leanly and as efficiently as we could, we need to manage things for contingencies, just in case bad things happen. And then when you dig into that one with people, the same theme, a number of sub-themes come out again. More diversity in terms of location of where the food comes from, more regional self-sufficiency, more redundancy, shorter supply chains, greater transparency. And there's a cluster of ideas that keep coming up again and again and again, which suggest that we need the taxpayer, we need the government to help rebuild the capacity of Canada and the Canadian communities, not only to produce its own food, but also to process and store it. But that won't be cheap. That'll come with costs. So we have to pause there and think, okay, how are we going to manage those costs? Because the economic system that we currently have, that just enough, just in time system we currently have, really does result in low costs for consumers. Okay, the second part of this discussion over agriculture as a cornerstone of a green recovery platform centered around agriculture and technology. And many of the folks that I interviewed suggested that there's a real opportunity right now for novel technologies to address some of these issues. Things like blockchain-enabled supply systems that offer transparency, or vertical farms that will be developed in Toronto to allow year-round growing seasons in the down metropolitan cores, or even small-scale, more community-oriented systems like technologies in plant breeding for strawberries that would be able to grow strawberries into the, for longer growth periods in the growing season and store them better. Folks told me that these technologies could not only result in better food sovereignty for Canada, but if we're careful about how we're deploying them, we could also result in a smaller environmental footprint in our food system, less greenhouse gas emissions, less water pollution, and we could also probably create jobs. And I'm happy to discuss this in detail in the Q&A, but I want to leave you with a sense of optimism that there's a widespread feeling in the industry right now. And by industry, I'm using a very intentionally broad definition of industry. It could be a big company like Maple Leaf, or it could be a small organic farmer working outside of Collingwood. There's a sense of optimism that, that agriculture is ideally poised to create jobs, to reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture, of our food system, and that we can probably embark on a green recovery program post-COVID with agriculture at the center. And this all gets me pretty excited, but before I get too carried away, let's pause and reflect. It all sounds fine and good theoretically, but it's vital to remember a few things. First of all, Canada is a country with winter, and we will currently, and we always will, I think, both import and export a lot of food. For instance, we're naturally suited to produce huge quantities of grains, of legumes, of oil crops, of protein. And those are going to be export crops for us. And we should celebrate that, and we should work with our exporters to make that as environmentally friendly and cost-effective and beneficial to society and the environment as possible. And our short growing season means we really do face limits on fruits and vegetables. And we will probably for many years. No matter how excited we get about vertical farming, I cannot see it replacing all of our fruits and vegetable imports from California. So I do not want to be misconstrued as suggesting Canada should become food self-sufficient and stop trade. Rather, it's a more nuanced position. I think what we're looking for is a balance with a greater degree of self-sufficiency in some key ingredients, such as fruits and vegetables, that are both labor dependent, and we are very, very dependent on imports. And then the second sort of caveat to this whole self-sufficiency argument is that nothing comes for free. And redundancy, regional self-sufficiency, creating transparency, these things will come at a cost. And unless we're careful about how we tackle these issues, we may do one of two bad things. The first bad thing we may do is increase costs to farmers and squeeze their incomes. And that's not a great outcome of moving towards a system. The other bad outcome that we have to avoid is increasing food costs and exacerbating our food insecurity problem. So I hope you'll all agree that if we embark on a process of food sovereignty post-COVID, we do it in a way that's mindful of the cost issue. And this tension between efficiency and self-sufficiency and resiliency and cost effectiveness leads me to the third key theme that comes out of Growing Stronger initiative, which is something I foregrounded at the beginning of my remarks. We need better collaboration in order to address these complicated, sticky tensions that involve trade-offs. We need better collaboration between sectors and between government, between businesses and civil society. We need the academics to roll up their sleeves and get engaged. And for too long, these work groups have worked in silos. The food security activists and the nutritionists talking to each other, but never including industry in that conversation. Industry and farm groups talking to each other, but never reaching out to an academic for expert opinions. Academics just churning out endless peer-reviewed journal articles and never engaging in what we call knowledge mobilization. All the interviews I did over the summer said this is a mistake that we've made for too long, and that it's one that we have to address. And it's not interesting particularly, it's not sexy, it doesn't have that sort of killer, intellectually pleasant argument to it, but it's the mechanics of getting change happening. So let me make this need for collaboration clear by expanding on a point that I just made, which is this tension between regional self-sufficiency and the way that if we don't be very careful about how we do it, it could create extra costs, which then are imposed on either poor consumers or on farmers. If that's a risk that we need to be aware of, then we need to design programs in a, quote, joined up way that puts farm supports with supports for regional storage and food hubs together with income supports for low-income consumers. And at the same time as we're doing that, we cannot be tying, say, our prairie lentil farmers that have great businesses selling lentils to India up in red tape. And so we really need to be actively collaborating around stakeholders to find pathways through all these competing agendas. So there's this need for collaborative governance across the sector. But here, I'm actually really happy that we seem to be making progress. And Ryan was nice enough to announce or to mention that I'd been recently appointed to the Canada's first National Food Policy Advisory Council. Getting this announcement 2 weeks ago was something that a lot of us had spent a tremendous amount of time working on over the last 5 years. Hundreds of hours have gone into that announcement. And I was so delighted when Minister Bibeau made this announcement and appointed this group of people, including me, to that list. And I'd like to point out that it's just worth reveling in the diversity on this slide. I think the minister did a phenomenal job, or the minister's team did a phenomenal job. And what you've got here, it's not perfect. I don't want to pretend it is, but you do have experts from across the farm to fork spectrum. There are retailers here. There are food security experts. There's Indigenous representation. It's a good group. And I've spent the last 2 weeks calling half of the people, and the co-chair, my co-chair, Sylvie Cloutier, has spent the last 2 weeks calling the other half of the people. And this group is very engaged to make change happen. And we've got our first meeting on Friday, or Thursday rather, so that's kind of exciting. So my fundamental point is that change, in my opinion, only comes when you bring the range of opinions and stakeholders together and you engage in dialogue that starts, I think, with articulating shared values and purposes, moves forward to develop strategies, acknowledges openly trade-offs, tries to build a portfolio of programs to maximize public, private, and environmental good. And I think that's where change happens. And again, I'm talking to an academic audience right now, and I'm sort of wishing I had some killer graph with some fabulous relationship on it. And I'm sort of moving away from that in my career. I've done the peer-reviewed journal article thing, and it's great, and it plays a role, but I don't think change happens in society out of a great multivariate analysis anymore. You have to have the science to underpin things, but I think that we need more of us rolling up our sleeves and engaging in dialogue in order to make change happen. So where I'm going to wrap this lecture up and stop talking at you and maybe start talking with you is last week I was doing one of these lectures and someone asked me an interesting question. And it was a question I don't think I had a very good answer for, but maybe I can ask it myself that question now and get a better answer out. And the question was, COVID has reshaped our society, but given us an opportunity to do things differently. So the person asked me, what would you like to carry forward out of COVID into the hoped for post-COVID world? And like I said, I don't think I answered this question really well last week, but here you go. Here's the answer that I'd like to have given. First of all, I think the pandemic has so brought forward the issues associated with food insecurity and unemployment, wealth, equity, and access. I think that pandemic has brought these issues to the surface so dramatically that for the first time in my career, I'm actually seeing a meaningful opportunity to drive change that addresses this longstanding issue. As I said a few minutes ago, if we want Canadians to be resilient to the next big crisis, we need people to be able to afford a dignified life. And this means we need to be embracing a host of policy and social programming options that put strategies to address colonialism, racism, all forms of marginalization at the core. And this means universal income floors, better engagement with Indigenous communities. That sort of set of policies have to be brought front and center. Second, and more related directly to food, I think there's so many problems with the ways we currently produce and distribute food, including the environmental costs, say, of exporting strawberries from California, which is in a drought, to Toronto, which has lots of water in midwinter, a process that's expensive and polluting, and frankly doesn't result in very good strawberries arriving in our stores. I think if the pandemic spurs us to investigate a range of innovations that could include social activism around buying local, government policies to help support farmers store food, high technology innovations such as vertical farms. If any of these innovations can cause our system to become more sovereign and more nutritious and shrink our environmental footprint, then the pandemic will have given us a real blessing in the long term. And I think that's an endeavor that's worth working towards. A third, and more personally, I've been trapped in this stupid bedroom for 12 months. I've been sitting staring at this camera for 12 months. And I've actually had a pretty productive year in terms of writing papers and stuff, and I've spent more time with my kids. I'm a bit more miserable. I'm frustrated. I'm cabin feverish. But I think there's been really good things coming about this because I'm no longer flinging my body around the globe. I haven't flown to Europe for 24 hours in a year. I haven't done back-to-back red eyes for a morning meeting in Vancouver in over a year. I'm not racing to Toronto to give a lecture and then racing home on a GO train for a year. So while I'm really desperate to get out of this bedroom and see people again, I'm also no rush to get back to the schedule that I had 12 months ago. And so I think we've all maybe learned, I certainly have, some important lessons about how to work better, more efficiently with a smaller personal environmental footprint. And I hope I don't unlearn those lessons once I'm vaccinated, whenever that may happen. So let me try to wrap up. I think that everybody, I'm shocked and terrified by the last year. The pandemic, Black Lives Matter, political polarization, stridency, militancy, the downright nastiness that seems to pervade this moment in history. Nevertheless, I actually am very optimistic that that teachable moment that we talked about, or I spoke of a few months ago, is poignant and is real, both for ourselves as people and community members, family members, but also for our society. And fundamentally, I believe that through a process of dialogue, identifying shared values, being open with our anxieties and what makes us worried and keeps us up at night, we can actually seize this opportunity and chart something like a better future. And I realize I'm getting sort of super normative at the closing of this, but it's a gray March morning or March afternoon. The weather's terrible. I'm feeling ennui like nothing else. So I have to end on a positive note, because if I didn't, then getting out of bed would be, frankly, really hard, even harder than it is. And I really do think we owe it to ourselves, to our children, to the world at the grandest possible way, all the way to the most micro sort of intimate relationships. I think we owe it to everybody to think really carefully about how we play our cards in the next 6 to 12 months, how we let the post-pandemic world unfold. I think to do that, we need to open ourselves up to each other's worries and understand each other's anxieties and find those strategies forward. I don't think science on its own or industry on their own or social activism on their own will do it. It's going to require all of us. But if we do this, then I'm going to make a bold statement that the future generations won't look back at 2020 and 21 and only see the disarray and chaos and disorder of the moment, but we will also see, hopefully, maybe, please, perhaps, the germination of something powerful and some powerful change happening. So with that, I'm going to say, Ryan, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you folks today. And I hope we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Evan. I'll give you a pause here, and I'm sure others are as well. So as Evan mentioned, we do have about 15 minutes for discussion. I will, Evan, if it's, well, I guess you and I can both co-manage this. I will open it up to the floor, and we can move forward in that regards. And if need be, it looks like somebody has posted in the chat box here, which is one option. And of course, you're most welcome to speak out loud. So in the chat box, Alexander writes, how can the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council help the government and education systems promote the importance of healthy eating and strengthening our immune systems so that we can prevent illnesses and diseases instead of focusing on treating diseases and illnesses? And how can the council convince the government to get rid of the food deserts in poor and racialized communities so that they can have access to healthy food?
Yeah, I mean, both of those are laudable goals and are goals that fit well within the food policy for Canada as currently articulated. So both of those would be things the government has at some level committed to do. The question is really about how this council, which hasn't yet met, is actually going to achieve that. And I mean, it becomes the theory of change question, right? I mean, the council, I think, at least as much as I have some control over the council, which answers to the minister, I'm co-chairing it with Sylvie. We will be, I believe, but this is to be determined because we haven't had our first meeting yet. We'll be convening conversations. We'll be writing reports. We'll be providing ongoing advice to the minister in order to shape her policy agenda. Of course, we're in a minority government situation, which makes policy change very challenging, to say the least. But that's the sort of levers of change we've got. In particular, one active file that's on my mind, and I've been hosting dialogues around this for the last month, is in the fall, so September of this year, the United Nations Food Systems Summit is being convened by the Secretary General. And there is a desire to have Canada say something important at the Food System Summit. So there will be a Canadian representative standing up at the Food System Summit and saying something. And I'm hoping that the Food Policy Advisory Council can help the minister say something which we will all be very proud of. And so, between convening conversations and providing expert advice, which is sort of the way advisory councils work, and specifically aiming at what we would like to see as a great announcement at the summit. Those are the hows, and the two priorities that that Alexander has identified are very laudable and plausible whats, both deserts and healthy eating.
Thank you, Evan. It looks like we also have a question from Thorsten Arnold.
All right, are you going to read it out, Ryan, again, or should I read it out?
Oh, I didn't realize it was posted in the chat box.
Oh, yeah, it's in the, sorry, I'm seeing
I can talk myself.
Perfect.
I can just read it myself. So we've made 15,000 this year on our farm, and we also earned 150,000 just because the land value of our 100-acre farm has appreciated, just because Torontonians are streaming into and buying up land around us. At this point, land is so expensive that no young person can own land anymore, which basically means the end of farming if the transition is interrupted. People tell me, well, yeah, it's institutional investors, foreigners, and rich people buying up the land. And this hasn't been mentioned very much, but what have you heard about that?
Hey, Thorsten, nice to be interacting with you again. We've swapped emails quite a few times, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, you're raising a big issue. Again, COVID hasn't created this issue though, has it? I mean, we had seen serious land price appreciation and enormous barriers to entry for young people into farming for most of my career. Average age of farmers is, but maybe not everybody on the call knows, is getting older. It's in its late 50s in Canada. Most farms in Canada do not have farm succession plans, and the intergenerational succession plan has really broken down as a model. So that all becomes a major challenge to address. So I'm simply restating your challenge, Thorsten. I'm not giving you an answer for it. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I mean, barriers to entry for farming is enormously challenging for young people. And unless you're born into a dairy farm, a family that has quota, it's really hard to get going. I did some numbers on slightly changing tax a little bit though. I ran some numbers that we published in well, Ian Mosby did all the real number crunching, where we wrote up in a chapter in our book, Uncertain Harvest. And getting in as an organic vegetable farmer is actually obtainable with a relatively modest capital investment in terms of land and equipment. And so certainly getting in at grains is prohibitive. Getting in at dairy is unbelievably prohibitive, but a young person could get involved in organic vegetable production and develop a business for themselves with a much smaller barrier to entry. But you're absolutely right. This is a huge issue, and I do not know who the next generation of farmers is going to be. So sorry for not answering your question in a positive way, but I acknowledge
the COVID impact has been, at least in Gray and Bruce County, that just people have been pouring out of the city, lots of early retirement. So just the land prices have almost doubled in the last 2 years here. And that's a COVID.
Wow.
That's
okay. I haven't
heard
that. That's the first time I've heard that one. Okay, that's huge. Ouch.
If nobody else is picking up, maybe I'll build somewhat upon Thorsten's theme. And thank you, Thorsten, for being here. It's great to get the agricultural producer's perspective. So, Evan, I'm going to pick you up on the bait that you put out there on particularly the automation in the food system, where you're doing the advocacy for that. In part, I'm assuming as a means to, is it to help lower food costs and or decrease dependence upon racialized, underpaid labor? And I think of and you're probably quizzical in terms of, well, how are we relating these two? And I think of, if we're talking about automation, that of course is another high cost for people wanting to enter agricultural production. And I think that's, obviously there are arguments in favor of automation, but I want to put this into conversation with Wei. On the one hand, the question is, well, how do we address that in terms of young people wanting to enter farming? And then secondly, I think of the food system more generally, and I'm thinking of a statistic that I recently read, and these have been around for years, but at least in the US context, for every dollar spent in the food system, agricultural producers get roughly 10 cents of every food dollar spent. And so much of that is going to middlemen. And I'm wondering if maybe, instead of automation, we just need to talk about a redistribution of value within the food system and how that could potentially support farmers and maybe even keep, on the one hand, pay those agricultural workers decent wages and potentially keep food costs low, if not lower them, if we could somehow think about different ways of distributing food. And I think, I'm tying this into our broader theme here, supply chains, right? And the different actors within supply chains.
So it's a great question, and it's a bit of a proverbial Gordian's knot of issues to untangle. I mean, we've faced a labor shortage in Canada in agriculture for 60 years. I said no to the family farm 20 years ago because it was easier and better paying to be a university prof talking and writing about farming than it was to produce strawberries in Agra. And I've always sort of regretted that decision on one level, but certainly in terms of a stable paycheck, no regrets whatsoever. And so we've have this chronic labor shortage in Canada. And conversely or perversely, we know that, say, at the University of Guelph, there's 4 graduates for every single ag science student that we put out the door. There's 4 jobs for every single ag science graduate that we put out the door. So there is enormous uptake for young people with the right skill set in the sector. And I sort of felt that I was facing a paradox. And then about 2 years ago, I was on a panel organized by the Royal Bank of Canada on one of their big sort of, it was their Humans Wanted report, how Canadian youth can thrive in the age of disruption. And they invited a couple of folks to discuss pedagogy and training and teaching in this sort of disrupted age. And I was sitting next to the head vintner for Peller Estates Winery in Niagara. So this would be one of Niagara's bigger wineries. And the first thing that was interesting was the head vintner for Peller Estates at the time, I don't know if it still is, was a woman in her 30s. So that, first of all, tells you that the sector is changing. Because certainly when I was working with my grandfather in the 90s in Niagara, there were very few women, especially young women, working in the winery industry. But then she pulled out her phone and she showed the audience how she could control the temperature and the irrigation and the wind machines on the winery in Niagara. And then she said, and that was interesting, it was kind of cool. And then she said she didn't even have to do that because they had soil sensors and moisture sensors and temperature sensors every 10 feet. And the system did it automatically because they'd invested heavily in automation. And that was interesting too. And then she said the really interesting part, which was that their payroll and the number of employees, both the average salary as well as the number of people employed, had grown over the last 5 years. So what this is suggesting to me, and I think this is true sector-wide, is that there is a very significant skills shift happening in agriculture right now, whereas some of the repetitive hand labor elements are being automated. And those are the things that are largely done by racialized folks coming into Canada on the temporary foreign worker program. If we can reorganize the training environment, then the students that are graduating in robotics, in engineering, in software, in marketing, in being a sommelier for the wine industry, there's actually huge opportunities. Other places, and it's a sector that's changing so rapidly that the repetitive hand labor bits are going away, but there's more and better jobs being added at the same time. And that was certainly the conclusion that John Stackhouse reached when he did the Farmer 4.0 report that came out about 18 months ago, again, RBC report. And certainly that confirms my observation. And it's not that we're losing jobs through automation, it's that the jobs are changing. So the robots aren't taking away the jobs, the robots are changing the jobs. And when I look at COVID and how COVID affected specifically the repetitive hand labor parts of the system, maybe that's okay, as long as we can maybe manage some of the transitions. But it's hard. It's really hard. The way I think about it, and I'll just stop rambling in just a sec, is 100 years ago, there was a lot of blacksmiths and vets geared out because our farm system was based around the draft horse. And then within 30 years, those vets and those blacksmiths had gone out of work and they'd been replaced by tractor dealerships. And some good things happened out of that transition and a lot of bad things happened out of that transition. I think that's the sort of mindset that we're sitting at the advent of the tractor and about to get rid of the draft horse. And maybe we can manage that transition better.
Okay, thank you. Tracy, did you have one last question? I saw your hand was up and then it went down.
I see it. There have been a couple more pop into the chat. So why don't we prioritize those?
Okay. I'm looking at the clock, so I suppose we have time just for one of these. Evan, it looks like there's 3 there. Do you want to just pick one or just all 3? I'll leave it up to your speakers.
Right. The first one I see is the first one. So from with regards to, would provision and promotion of vegan food help solve the dilemma? This always comes up. One, animal agriculture is a vital part of a sustainable agro-ecosystem because it cycles nutrients and provides value to pasture. 2, animal agriculture is a vital part of about 1 billion people's livelihoods on the planet, many of whom are poor. 3, many of the ways we do animal agriculture today are completely unsustainable, and there's 1.5 billion cows on the planet, and that's way too many. And so we need to be addressing the livestock issue. I believe, I have this hunch, this isn't actually a wish, this is more of my reading of the tea leaves, the world I think we're moving into. I think the advents around plant-based protein and cellular agriculture are such that the market will adjust over the next 10 years, and we will see less animals being produced at a global level as these other products come on the market. It will be a wrenching transition for farm families all over the world. And the role of policy is to steer that transition in a way that minimizes the pain and maximizes the likely environmental gain of getting the number of cows on this planet to a reasonable number.
Okay. Thank you very much, Evan. We are at 5:01 and we do try to end at 5. So I apologize to those of you who still had questions, but we will end promptly at 5. So thanks everybody for being here this week. And I also, before I thank Dr. Fraser, just a reminder that next week we'll have Susan Chatwood talking about health system resilience in northern and remote Indigenous communities. And lastly, Dr. Fraser, Evan, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to have you here, even if virtually. I always enjoy listening to you and talking with you. So be well, and everybody else. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.